What's going on, guys? Welcome to my Prisma crash course. So in the constantly evolving world of web development, choosing the right tools and frameworks can really make all the difference in the world. And one tool that's been gaining traction for quite a while now is Prisma. It's an open source ORM for Node.js and TypeScript. And when it comes to building an application and interacting with your database, Prisma really simplifies that process. So we're going to spend a few minutes in some slides, talk about what it is, why you would use Prisma, and then we're going to jump in and get down to business. I'll show you how to get set up, how to use the Prisma client, and it's a data access layer, so you're typically going to use it with some kind of server-side rendering framework like Next.js, or a backend framework like Express or Nest.js. But I'll show you how to get set up, and we'll create our data models, and we'll go from there. All right, but like I said, first I just want to talk a little bit about what Prisma is and why you would use it. So, like I briefly mentioned, Prisma is an open source modern database ORM and toolkit that makes it easier for developers to work with databases, and it really simplifies the whole process. Now, an ORM is an object relational mapper, and instead of interacting with your database using tedious raw SQL queries, you have a nice object-oriented interface that is much cleaner and easier and more enjoyable to work with. So if you've ever used something like Sequelize or Mongoose for MongoDB, it's similar to how those work. And you can use Prisma for just about anything from REST APIs to GraphQL APIs to full stack applications, command line interfaces, and so on. And Prisma provides type safety and catches data-related errors at runtime, meaning that you can identify and address potential issues before your code even runs, resulting in a more reliable and bug-free application. And you can use Prisma with regular JavaScript or TypeScript. However, it does encourage TypeScript. And when we get into our example, we will be installing TypeScript, and we'll actually we'll use TS Node to run our files, but we're not going to actually write any types or anything like that. So if you don't know any TypeScript at all, that's absolutely fine. Now, as far as actual databases that you want to use, that's up to you. It's typically used with relational databases like Postgres, MySQL, SQLite, etc. However, you can also use it with NoSQL databases such as MongoDB. And what's really cool is that your code and your model isn't going to change based on your database. So you could technically just swap out one for the other just by editing the .env file and changing your database credentials. So it also automatically generates code based on your database schema. So again, if you've used Sequelize or Mongoose, and there's plenty of other ORMs out there, you usually create some kind of schema, and that's what we do with Prisma. So usually with relational databases, you have to create all your fields and your types and tables, and you do that on the database level before you even start coding. But with Prisma, you just create your models, and then you simply run a migration, and it will look at your model and create all your tables. Rows, columns, and also any constraints, any primary keys, auto increment, anything like that. It'll do it on its own. You don't have to go in at the database layer and do it on your own like we had to, back in the old days. So there's really three parts to Prisma. So first is the Prisma client. That's the auto-generated and type-safe query builder for Node.js and TypeScript. So you can use the Prisma client with any Node or TypeScript application. That includes a full stack app, REST API, GraphQL API, whatever it might be. And it supports auto-completion and type checking in your IDE. Works great with VS Code. And if you're building a single-page app in a full stack, with a full stack application, you're typically going to use Prisma on the server, and then you're going to create your routes to expose the API endpoints for your front end to interact with. But one combination that I really like is Next.js with React Server components, because then you can use the Prisma client right from the component. But it really depends on what you're building. So then we have Prisma Migrate, which is the declarative data modeling and migration system. So Prisma Migrate is designed to simplify and automate the process of managing your database schema as your application evolves. And it's designed to preserve your existing data during schema migrations. And then lastly, we have Prisma Studio, which is a graphical user interface to view and edit your data in your database. And it's the only part of Prisma that's not open source. It's very helpful because you can view and edit your data right within the browser, but it's not required to use Prisma. Now, for those of you that haven't used something like SQLize or Mongoose or any ORM, I just want to quickly go over data modeling. So data modeling is the process of defining the data requirements and the structure of a system, and it's used to define the data model for a database. So in Prisma, this usually involves describing the database schema, including tables, fields, data types, and their relationships to each other. Effective data modeling in Prisma is crucial because it forms the foundation that your database operations and your queries are built on, and it ensures that the data is structured efficiently, accurately, and that it aligns with the needs of your application. So we're going to get into creating our schema. We're just going to create a user schema and an article schema. We're also going to have a relationship between a user and an article. Now, to get started, we're going to first install TypeScript TS Node, which is what we'll use to run our TypeScript file directly, and then also the Node.js types. And then we're going to initialize TypeScript with tsc-init. Then we can install Prisma, and then we can initialize Prisma, and then we'll start to write our schema and model our data. All right, so let's get into it. All right, guys, so I just have an empty folder called Prisma Crash, and I have that opened in VS Code with my integrated terminal. So if you want to follow along, just go ahead, create a folder, open it in your editor. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is just initialize a package.json with npm, npm init-y. So that will create my package.json. Then we're going to install some dependencies, some dev dependencies, first being TypeScript. And then we also want TS Node and then the Node.js types. So that's going to be at types/node. And we want to install those as dev dependencies. Okay, next thing we're going to do is initialize TypeScript. And we can do that with npx tsc and then --init. That's just going to create a TS config file. Now, like I said, we're not really doing anything with TypeScript, so we're not going to go into that file. We don't really need to pay attention to any configuration. We're just initializing it. So let's install Prisma now. So we'll say npm install Prisma. And then we can initialize Prisma by saying npx Prisma and then init. Now from here, I'm just going to add --data source -provider. Now you can decide what database you're going to use under the hood. It could be Postgres, it could be MySQL, MongoDB. Now if you're using any of those, you have to make sure they're installed on your system. So I'm going to make this easy so that all of you guys can follow along, and I'm just going to use SQLite because it's simply a DB file. We don't have to install anything extra. And the way that we create our models and write our code is going to be the exact same whether we're using SQLite or Postgres or something else. So we'll go ahead and run that. All right, now you'll see that there's a few files and folders that got added. If we look at the .env file, this is where you're going to describe your database credentials. Now, since we're using SQLite, all we have here is a database URL, and it's a file. It's going to be this dev.db. And we don't have to create that. Once we create our migration and we run it, it'll create that file for us. So we don't have to worry about creating anything. If you're using, MySQL, Postgres, MongoDB, etc. This is where you're going to put your connection string, your credentials, all that stuff. You can just visit this URL here to set that up. But like I said, all the rest of our code is going to be the same regardless of what database we're using. So in the Prisma folder, there's a schema.prisma file. So this is going to be where we model our data. This is our schema. And there's essentially three parts to a Prisma schema. We have the data source, which you can see right here, or the data source block, and this is where we define our database connection. You can use any database that Prisma supports. Like I said, Postgres, MySQL, etc. We're using SQLite, so that's already there for us. The URL is in the .env file, and we're accessing it with this line right here. So that's the data source. Then we have the generator. So the generator block is where you define the Prisma client generator. This is what generates the Prisma client for you, and you can use any language that Prisma supports. This includes JavaScript, TypeScript, Golang, Rust. I think those are the main ones. And then we have our model, which is obviously isn't here. That's what we need to define. So we're going to go ahead and do that right down here. We're going to have a user model and an article model. And I also want to have a relationship between them where a user can have multiple articles and an article can have one user. So let's start with the user. So we just say model and then whatever the model name, in this case user. And in this block, we're going to create our fields. So I want an ID field. And as far as a type, it's going to be an int. And you'll see I'll get a drop down too here of different types. And then I want this to be the primary key, and I want it to auto increment. So what we can do is say at ID, and then we can say at default, and then inside default we can define auto increment. You can see we get a drop down for that as well. So that will give us an ID field in our user table that is a primary key that also auto increments. Then I'm going to have an email. Let's say we want that to be a string, and I also want that to be unique, so I'm going to add at unique. Then we're going to have a name for the user. That's also going to be a string, and I want it to be optional. So as you can see, there's an option to use a question mark. So that will make it optional. Then I want to have a field that will have all of that particular user's articles. So we'll call this articles, and we're going to set that to the article model, and we're going to add some brackets here because it's going to be multiple articles. Now we see this squiggly red line because that's not created yet. It says it's not a built-in type, and it doesn't refer to another model, obviously because we haven't created it yet. So now let's create it. So we'll say model and then article, and now you'll see that that red line goes away. Well, now another one's back, but that's because we have no fields here. So let's add an ID. Actually, I can just copy this line here because, again, I want this to be the primary key, and I want it to auto increment. Then we're going to have a title. That's going to be a string. And then let's do a body for the article. That'll be a string, and we'll make it optional. And let's do an author. Now this is where I want to add a relationship. So the author is going to be from the user model, and then we can add over here at relation, and inside the relation we can describe fields, and I want to have a field of author ID, and we want that to reference, so it's going to reference the user model that I put here, and we want this to basically be connected to the ID field of the user. So we're going to say references, and then in here ID. Okay, then we can put an author ID field, and that's going to be int. So we're just saying here we want a relationship for this author field to the user table, and it's going to reference the ID, and basically the author ID of this model is going to reference the ID of that user model. All right, and that's it. So that's all I want to do as far as our data goes, our data modeling. So we'll save that. Now to actually, because right now there's nothing in the database. Doesn't matter whether we're using SQLite, Postgres, anything. All we've done is created a file. So now let's run the migration. So we can do that in the terminal. We'll say npx and then Prisma migrate, and then I want to give it a name. So I'm going to say dev-name, and we'll call it init. So now that's going to run the migration, and you'll see it just flashed real quick, but it says your database is now in sync with your schema. And if we look over to the side here, you're going to see that dev.db. Now, I can't see anything here. There are extensions you can use to see SQLite data, but I'm not going to see it here. I'm going to show you Prisma Studio in a little bit, which will actually give us a GUI that shows us our data. But the file is created, so essentially our database is created. If you were using Postgres, for instance, that database would be created. And then in the migrations folder, notice that it'll be a number and then underscore init because that's what we chose to call it. And inside there is the actual migration where it created a table with the 3 fields. ID is the primary key, auto increment. Then we have our article table. So this is our migration file that was run. Now, since we have our database with our tables in it, now I want to use the Prisma client to interact with it. So let's create a new file. In the root here, I'm going to create index.ts. And from here, we want to import the Prisma client. So let's say import Prisma client. And then what we'll do is initialize a variable called Prisma, set that to a new instance of the Prisma client. So now we can use that to query our data. We can use it to create users, create articles, etc. Now we do have to create a main function to run. So let's say async function main. And then this is where our Prisma queries will go. And then to run this function, we're going to come down here and say main, and this will actually return a promise. So we want to add a dot then and a dot catch onto that. And then the dot then, let's add a function here. It's going to be asynchronous. And what we want to do is then disconnect from Prisma after everything is said and done. So we're going to await Prisma and then dot money sign disconnect. Okay, so we want to do that. And then in the catch here, we'll say async. We'll have a function, and we're going to pass in a parameter here of e. So if anything goes wrong here, we can actually just console log whatever that error is. Actually, let's say console.error. And then we still want to disconnect, so we're going to say await, and then Prisma dot money sign disconnect. And then we're also going to exit the process with failure. So we want to say process.exit and just pass in a 1 here. And now that should do it. Whenever we run this file, whatever queries we put in here will now run. And if you were building an application with, let's say, Next.js, you would do this from within your application, and you would get your data, you would then load it into your UI and so on. But we're not dealing with any UI. We're dealing strictly with Prisma in this TypeScript file. So let's get rid of that comment. And the first thing that we're going to do is create a user. All right, so I'm just going to go through different queries that we can do as far as fetching data, creating, updating, deleting. So what I'll do is write out the query so you can see what it looks like, how it works, and then I'll comment it out, because every time we run this file, it'll run this function. So obviously we don't want the same user to keep being created. So I'm just going to keep things commented out. All right, now what we'll do is we'll say const user, set that to await, because this will return a promise, and then Prisma dot whatever model we want to deal with, in this case user. And then there's tons of different methods we can use. I'm going to use create. And in create, we're going to pass in an object with a data object. And that's going to be our user data. So let's say name. We'll set that to John Doe. Let's say email. We'll set that to john@gmail. And yeah, that should do it. And then we'll just console log that user. Save that, and then we can run this file. So we're going to clear this up, and let's do npx, because remember, it's a TypeScript file. So to run it directly, we're going to use ts node, and then the name of the file, which is index.ts. And you can see we get back an object with that user data, and the ID is 1, because remember, it's going to be 1 to start with, the first user, and then it's going to auto increment. So the next one will be 2, and so on. All right, now we created a user, so now let's comment that out, and I want to show you how we can get all of the users in the database. So right here, let's say we'll say get all users, and then say const users, set that to await Prisma.user, because that's the model we want, and then we're going to use a method called find many. And if we go ahead and run the file again, we should see an array. So notice it has brackets. It's an array with that one user. So that's how we can get data. Now, I want to start to work with the relationships, because remember, we have a relationship between articles and users. So let's create a new article and associate it with this John user. So I'll go ahead and we'll just comment that out for now. And then let's say create an article and associate it with user. So we'll say const article. We're going to set that to await Prisma.article.create. And when we create, we pass in an object with a data object and set the title. So the title will say John's first article, and then we'll have a body, and for the body we'll say this is John's first article. Okay, so that's the title and the body. Now I want to associate it with the John user, so remember there's an author field, and I'm going to say author, and then we can pass in this connect object, and we're going to connect to ID 1 because that's John's ID. And then underneath that, we'll just console log the article. All right, so let's run the file now. I'm going to clear this up. And we can see an object with the ID, title, body, and the author ID is set to 1. So the reason that it does that is because of that connection that we set right here, or that relation, I should say. Now we can get all the articles if we want. So let's comment out this where we just created, and let's say get all articles. And if you want to pause the video and try it on your own, I mean, it should be pretty obvious how to do this. Same way that we got the users. I guess that's kind of drilled in my mind because I've been working on that challenges course for the past few months, and I constantly say pause the video and try it. But it's a good way to learn, to just try things on your own. So let's say articles, and we're going to set that to await, and then Prisma.article.find many, and then we'll console log articles. Come down here, run that, and now we get an array of the articles in the database, or in that table. So if we can create an article and associate it with a user, we can do the opposite. We can create a user and associate it with an article, or better yet, create the article and the user at the same time. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to pause. I'm going to comment that out. Let's say create, we're going to create a user and article and associate them. So it's really cool that we can do this stuff just from adding that relationship in the model. So let's say user or const user, and set that to await, and then Prisma.user create, and in here we're going to pass in our object with our data. So this is a user, so we're going to say the name. We'll say Sarah Smith. And what else do we have? Email. We'll set that to sarah@gmail. And then for the article, what we can do is simply put in articles, because remember, that's a field. If we look at our model right here, articles. So I'm going to set that to an object, and inside that object, we can set create, and then set that to an object. And the article that I want to create is going to have a title. Let's say Sarah's first article, and then a body. This is Sarah's first article. Okay, and that should do it. Now down here, I'll just console log user and get rid of this one. So that should create both a user and an article and associate the two. So if we run the file, we see the user, right? Now notice it doesn't show the article, but I just want to quickly make sure the article was created. So I'm going to uncomment this where it's getting all the articles, and then comment this out, and then log the articles. And then run that again, and we should see two. Yep, so there we go, John's and Sarah's article. Now the reason, so if I log the users again, right, come up here, let's comment that out, let's uncomment where we get users. If we do that, and we run the file, we see the two users, but the articles aren't shown by default. So if you do want to get the users with their articles, what you can do is in here in the find many, we can pass in an object and we can say include, and then inside that we'll say articles and set that to true. So now if I run the file again, we should get the articles field, and you can see it's just set to an object. It doesn't show us in the console. Now I want to show you how we can loop through a specific user's article and show that and do whatever we want with it, but let's create one more before we do that. We'll create another article with Sarah, for Sarah. So let's say create another article, and this time we're not going to well, yeah, we're going to associate it with Sarah. So let's say const article, set that to await prisma.article.create, pass in the data. So for this, we'll say title, we'll say just sample article, and body, this is a sample article. And then I want to associate it with the user. So remember, we have the author field. So I'm going to set that and then connect to the author with the ID of 2, which is Sarah. And then we can just console log the article. So if I run that, we should see the sample article, right? And then if I want to fetch all the articles, I can uncomment that, comment this out, and then console log the articles, and we should see 3 of them. Yep, so we have 1 from John and 2 from Sarah. Now I want to get Sarah's articles and loop through them. So if you want, pause the video, try it out. I mean, you should be able to do it as long as you know basic JavaScript. You could just use a for each. So let's do that. We'll say loop over Sarah's articles. Okay, so I'm going to say users. We first want to fetch the users. Let's make sure, comment that out, and we're fetching the users with the articles. That's important. Okay, and then we'll say users dot for each, and inside here let's say for each user, then we're going to console log. I don't want to loop over Sarah's articles. I want to loop over the users and then loop over all of the users' articles. So we get a list of the users with their articles. So in this console log, we're going to say user. We'll use a template string, and then say user dot name, and we'll put their email as well. So let's say comma email, and then user dot email. So we'll do that, and then let's console log. We'll say articles colon. Obviously, in a real application, I shouldn't say real, but in a web app, you'd have this on your web page, not just logging in the console. So let's say user.articles, and we want to loop through that now, because now we're in a single user, right? Inside this for each is a single user, so now we're going to take their articles and we're going to loop through those. So let's say for each article then let's console log, and we'll use a template string here, and we'll put a dash title colon, and then put the article title, and then comma, then we'll say body, and then we'll get the article dot body, and yeah, that should do it. And then underneath that for each, I'm just going to add a new line, so we'll say console log, and we'll do a /n. So now let's run the file, and you can see what we get is, let's see, we're looking under this line here. So we have user John Doe, the user's email. Then we have articles. We have the title, John's first article. We have the body. Then we go to Sarah, and we have her information, and then we have her 2 articles. All right, so you can see how easy this is to work with. If you were to do this with raw SQL queries, you'd have to write joins and all that, and it just gets messy and tedious and complicated. But you know, using something like Prisma makes this really easy to work with. All right, so now what I want to do is just show you how to update and remove data. So I'm going to comment out the for each here. And let's come down here and let's say update data. So let's say we want to update John Doe's name to John Doe Jr. So I'm going to say const user, set that to await Prisma user, and we're going to use the update method here. Okay, and in update, we're going to have an object, and we're going to say where, because we want to know which one we need to update. We'll say the user with the ID of 1. Then underneath that where object, we're going to have the data object. And that's where we want to specify what we want to update, which is going to be the name. Let's set that to John Doe Jr., like that. And then underneath that, we'll just console log the user. All right, so let's run the file. And now you can see the name, we have John Doe Jr. So that's how we can update. Now to remove actually let's remove an article. We'll remove the second article, or the third article. I think that would have an ID of 3. So yeah, let's comment this out. And I'm going to show you Prisma Studio in a second. That'll show us everything in a graphical user interface. So let's say remove article, or just say remove data. So for that, we're going to say const article, set that to Prisma dot article, and then the method is called delete. And in delete, we want to specify where. So much easier than an SQL where clause and doing all that type of thing. So ID, let's say 2. So we want to delete where 2. And yeah, I don't think, let's see, if I console log article, I'm not sure what that gives me actually. Let's try it out. Okay, so it gave me the article with the ID of 2, but that should be deleted. So let's fetch the articles. So we'll come up here and uncomment that and comment this one out. And let's log articles, and we should see just articles 1 and 3. So let's see. Yep, so ID 1, ID 3. So we removed the one with 2. All right, so that's CRUD with Prisma. So pretty cool, pretty easy. Now for Prisma Studio, all we have to do is simply run npx Prisma Studio. And it just opened on my other monitor. Let me just bring it over here. And we can see all of our models, our articles and users. So if we look at our users, we have John has our ID, email, name, John Doe Jr., because we updated it. And then it shows the relationship here, the article. And if I click on it, it shows me all of the articles. right? And then I could go over here and choose article, and then I can see the articles in my database along with the relationship to the users. And we can go ahead and click add record here, and the ID is auto increment, so you can see it just says auto increment. Let's just say sample article 2, and then body, I'll just say hello world. And then for the author, I'm going to choose John, and then author ID, you can see is 1. So that should get added. All I have to do is click save, and now we have a new article by John. And if I jump back into VS Code and let's get the articles, so we're already selecting them there and then logging them. So I'm going to open up a new tab here, and let's run npx ts-node index.ts. And you can see the article I just added has an ID of 4 because it's auto increment. It's connected to the John user, sample article 2, and the body is hello world. All right, so I mean, this is just a small glimpse of how Prisma works. So hopefully this helped you guys out, gave you some insight, and try using it in a project. When I redo my Next.js course, Prisma is high on the list of one of the technologies that I'll use for the back end. But yeah, so that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.